Hello friends, my name is Matt. I'm the youth and family pastor at Cornerstone Church in Marshfield, and I'm here today with your Cornerstone Connection, a daily devotional. So sometimes it's just really helpful to look at some of the basics in the Christian walk, and even though maybe we've talked about them before, it's always good to review and be reminded of some things that might be helpful as we walk with Christ daily. So as I've referenced before, I'm currently in a devotional by Tim Keller called God's Wisdom for Navigating Life, and it's really blessed my life. I'd recommend it to anybody who's looking for a devotional. But today's entry, he was talking about how do we as Christians defend ourselves from temptation. Well, what I first want to talk about is temptation itself. It's important for us to know temptation in and of itself is not sin. Just because you're feeling tempted to sin does not mean you are sinning. That's very important to recognize. So temptation is not sin, but it leads to sin, right? And the first thing that Keller suggests about defending ourselves from temptation, because that temptation leads to sin, so the first thing was this. He says, watch your heart. And it's really important because he doesn't say, oh, watch out for this person or that person, or watch out for anything that's outside of you. He says, watch your heart. And why is that? Well, perhaps you've read before in James chapter 1, verse 14, he says this. He says, each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. You know, sometimes we always like to point the finger at someone else, or perhaps even at God, who can't even tempt us because he's not tempted by evil. He's not evil at all. But we like to point the finger at someone else and say, he tempted me, or she tempted me, or it tempted me. And what James is making very clear is that we get dragged and we get tempted by our own evil desires, our own fallen, sinful nature. So we need to watch our heart. We need to guard our heart, friends. Second, Keller says this. He says, second, we must not stray into the paths of temptation. You and I, if we've been walking with Christ for a while, but perhaps even if we haven't, we know the things that often tempt us and tempt us most easily and cause us to trip up and to stumble and to sin. If we know those things, you and me, I'm with you here. We must avoid those paths of temptation. Let's not put ourselves in the path of temptation, but let's avoid it at all cost. Who knows what it is? It could be a flirtatious work relationship. It could be a situation with your spouse or your kids in which usually your anger turns into sin. It could be a financial situation that you're tempted to sin with money. I don't know what it is. You do. And let's avoid those paths of temptation so that temptation doesn't turn into sin. Third, Keller says this. He said we need to assure ourselves of the inevitable damage and spiritual destruction that will always come if we continue to put ourselves in the path of temptation. Friends, it doesn't take long. You can Google search Christian figures that have fallen. It doesn't take long to find out that lives can be ruined because we have allowed ourselves to be put into situations of temptation that have led to sin. And so often I think it's our own pride that gets us in trouble. We often think, I've been walking with Jesus for a long time. I've got this whole temptation thing figured out. And friends, we've never arrived. We're never going to be beyond Satan wanting to tempt us. He doesn't ever look at us and go, Matt's such a great Christian and he's so obedient that I'm not going to try and tempt him anymore. No, nobody's not in Satan's targets, okay? We need to be aware that he is always on the attack, especially for those who are following Christ. Let's keep in mind that he wants to destroy us. He wants to bring death in our life. That is his goal. That's his desire. And so let's be on guard with that. Friends, I've always been encouraged by a scripture that I'm sure you're very familiar with in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. The Apostle Paul writes this. He says, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. What's our greatest hope in fighting against temptation? Simple answer, God. He's faithful, friends. He can't not be faithful. And so in those moments when you're feeling tempted, look for that way out. Look for that exit sign, because God is faithful to provide it, and He will allow you to escape that temptation. Have a great day, friends. We'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.